Square foot gardening isn't for every gardener, but it could be ideal for you. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and I discuss everything gardening so that you can become a better gardener. Today, let's get started with square foot gardening. In 1975, a guy from New Jersey had just retired from a consulting engineering business and decided he wanted to start gardening as a hobby. Well, he ended up forming a community garden as part of a local environmental group and learned about gardening as it was done at that time. He was a pretty smart guy, and he recognized that a lot of what he was learning and doing just didn't make sense. So he started refining and improving and coming up with an idea. And in 1981, he published a book, Square Foot Gardening. It was hugely successful. And in 2007, he updated it with the second edition of all new Square Foot Gardening. The subtitle is The Revolutionary Way to Grow More in Less Space. And this idea really was revolutionary. It was based on common sense and just observation. But square foot gardening is now done in one way or another by most gardeners, even if they don't admit that some of the basics can come from this book. And I'll post this book in the comments below if you're interested in it. Today's video will show you all the steps you need to get started with Mel Bartholomew's idea, square foot gardening. The beauty of square foot gardening is that it's ideal for a brand new gardener who has no idea of how to begin. And it can also be ideal for a more experienced gardener who's just trying to figure out how to put the most plants in the smallest space. And the concept is extremely simple. It takes all of the great gardening ideas we have and don't know what to do with and brings them down into just 1 square foot. So this bed, 4 foot by 8 foot, could be quite daunting. Figuring out what am I going to grow and where am I going to put the seeds. But if I just look at each individual square, I can figure out what seeds are going to go right here. And then I expand that out and I've got 32 individual squares. Well, that makes it quite simple when it comes for planning and planting what goes in my garden. 1 square at a time, I choose the plants. And then when I come outside, I've already got it figured out. To do it right, square foot gardening does require planning ahead of time. When you look at a seed packet, it tells you precisely how far apart the plant should be. So for instance, these beets should be thinned 4 to 6 inches apart. Bartholomew doesn't use that type of measurement. Instead, he breaks the plants into categories based on their size. They're small, medium, large, and extra large. And so these beets fall into the medium category, which means I can put 9 of them in a square foot. If I have small plants, like the radishes, I can put 16 per square foot. The large plants are 4 per square foot, and the extra large is just 1 plant per square foot. When I identify what I'm going to be growing, I can reference it in the Square Foot Gardening book and then figure out exactly how many plants are going to go in each of the square feet. So I looked at what seeds I had available and what plants I wanted to grow, and I just drew a grid that's 8 feet by 4 feet. And each of these is a square foot to identify what plants are going to go there. I want peas on this side. Looking in the book, peas are actually 8 plants per square foot. So that's the number 8 to give me a guidance when I go out to the garden. I'm growing beets, but I want full-size beets, and I also want to harvest early to get some baby beets. So in this section, I'll have 9 beets per square foot, and in this section, I'll have 16 beets per square foot. This came right out of the book. 4 plants of chard, 9 plants of kale, And so I've just laid out this grid based on the plants I want to grow and how many of them will go in each square foot of my bed. Square foot gardening is specifically designed to be done in a raised bed. And in his book, Bartholomew shows you exactly how you can make some raised beds. I've got videos on that as well. He suggests filling the bed with what he calls Mel's mix, which is 1/3 peat, 1/3 vermiculite, and 1/3 compost. That can get a little expensive to fill a big bed like this, but that's one of those things you've got control over when you decide how to fill your raised bed. The most important factor is actually constructing a grid. And he suggests making an actual lattice of wood that you lay down on the soil. You want to identify every single individual foot so that you can put your plan into action. I find it much easier to make a grid out of twine. To construct the grid for this bed, I just started by taking a tape measure and with a pencil marking every single foot around the exterior. Now, before you raise questions, yes, I know that the inside of this bed is not exactly 4 feet by 8 feet. It is exactly 8 feet long, but it's only 3 feet 9 inches wide. So I did cut a few quarters of an inch off the squares going the short way. That's okay. It's not going to make that big a difference. At each of those pencil marks, I put a nail into the wood. And I use roofing nails. They've got a flat top that helps keep the twine from slipping off. And then after the nails were in place, I just took the twine and ran it from nail to nail around the entire bed. Tied it off at the end, and now I'm left with this beautiful grid. The important concept to realize is that it's okay for different plants to be growing side by side. So this square foot might only have 1 plant, and the one right next to it might have 4 plants, and the one next to that might have 9 plants, and the one to the side of that might have 16 plants. It really doesn't matter. You just identify what plants are growing in each individual square. Don't get overwhelmed because you might have 32 squares and you've got to break it down into 1 or 4 or 9 or 16 plants in each individual square. Just take it 1 square foot at a time. And for this, I like to use a trowel. A plant like spinach is 1 per square. So start by making a cross that splits the sides, and in the middle, you would put your broccoli plant. Now, if you're doing a plant like chard that is recommended 4 per square foot, well, it's the same basic idea. You use the same grid, and now you put your 4 chards. If you're doing a plant like radish that takes 16 per square foot, well, you just make a grid that allows you to put in 16 of the individual radish plants. Now, of course, we're going to be starting this from seed, and so you don't really want to get so far ahead of yourself that you're thinking in terms of starting plants in a bed like this. But this gives you an idea of how you can grow a lot of plants in a very small space. Please don't misunderstand me. This system is ideally suited for seeds, and that's what I primarily use it for. But you can transplant individual plants at the appropriate spacing. If you're putting 9 plants per square, well, then you just draw the grid to allow for 9. There are some bigger plants that might require more than 1 square foot. So for instance, a zucchini plant, a summer squash, might take as many as 9 of these individual squares. All of that is described in the book. And that identifies one of the deficiencies within the square foot gardening. If you look at a seed packet, it'll tell you what the recommended distance is between plants. But when you're putting a lot of plants into a grid, you kind of have to refer to the book to understand how many plants go into each individual square foot. So you'll need to have the book as a reference or look up some source that gives you the same basic information. He includes a lot of plants in this book, but it doesn't include everything that you could possibly grow. So sometimes, like with the winter squashes or the summer squashes, you have to kind of figure out which of the plants in here most closely matches with the plant that you're putting into the ground. There's nothing magical that makes the plants grow better when you use square foot gardening. You still need to make sure that your bed is in an area with adequate sun, at least 6 hours of sun during the growing season. And it still needs access to water, and it still needs the appropriate nutrients for the plants. Now, Mel's mix should give you enough nutrition if you use that soilless mix, but if you use some other type of soil, you have to anticipate that the plants are going to need normal nutrition, especially when you've got a lot growing close together. Probably one of the biggest disadvantages to square foot gardening is the upfront cost. You have to build the bed and you have to fill it with some of that nutrient soil. You can try a similar system in open ground or in a bed that you already have, and the same basic concept can work. And that's how I typically use the principles of square foot gardening. I don't necessarily run a grid if I'm planting in an open area bed, but I can still break it down into individual square feet when it comes to planning and planting. Mel suggests that one 4-foot by 4-foot bed can provide one person with all of the salad crops needed during the growing season, to have a salad every single day. And one additional 4-foot by 4-foot bed can provide all of the vegetables that that person can eat at dinner. And by adding one more 4-foot by 4-foot bed, you can actually harvest enough that you can preserve into the winter. I like to think of it as one 4-foot by 8-foot bed for each member of the family to provide food during the season. And then every bed beyond that is just extra to preserve. There are other important gardening methods that need to take place to get that much food. Bringing it down to an individual square, let's say of radishes. When we harvest those radishes, the square is empty. So we should put plants into that square again, even while the rest is growing. And so as you harvest the plants in each square, you need to think about starting new seeds or putting new transplants in every square that you've just harvested. This is succession planting. And Mel talks about it much more in his book. That's what makes this method so efficient, is there's always something growing in this bed, and you're continually rotating the crops 1 square foot at a time. If you're concerned that you might not be able to grow the tall plants that need a trellis, don't worry about that. You can still put a trellis in the bed. So for plants like beans or tomatoes, they can grow up the trellis. Do realize in your planning that you might want to group some of those plants together to take advantage of that trellis, because it's going to take up space. But it's definitely something you can do. If you're brand new to gardening and the idea of putting seeds in the ground is already a daunting task, and now we've thrown in all of these grids, don't worry about that either, because there's a lot of information in this book. It's more than just putting a grid in place and how many plants go in each individual square foot. There's a lot of information about how to put the seeds in the ground and how to take care of the plants and how to harvest and how to keep that rotation going. I definitely recommend this for your gardening library. If you like to grow a lot of the same plant, then you might not need square foot gardening. If I want half of this bed to be beets, I don't need a grid. I can just lay out the seeds and put a lot of beets in. Or if I want the entire bed to be tomato plants, I don't need a grid for that. I can just put the transplants in place and start growing them. It also isn't a great system for perennial vegetables. Asparagus goes in and stays in for a couple decades. The same with rhubarb. So there's no reason to have this grid in place every single year for plants that are just going to keep coming back and expanding in a particular space. But if you want to grow a lot of plants that are changing in a specific bed, square foot gardening can really give you the guidance for how to place those plants. And it's definitely something you should consider trying in your garden. If you have any questions, do let me know below. And if you really want to be serious about becoming a better gardener, go ahead and check out some of these other videos that may help you on your journey. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.